If you think Kundalini is just about an energy rising up the spine, then maybe you're only seeing the shell. Because what the ancient traditions were really pointing to wasn't just an ascending force, but a silent intelligence, a living consciousness dormant within you, waiting to be recognized. And what awakens it is not effort, it's not technique. It's something almost no one talks about: the purity of observation. Most people seek this awakening like someone looking for a miracle outside themselves. But the secret was never outside. At its core, Kundalini responds to presence. And presence begins with the gaze. Not the physical gaze, but the inner one, the one that observes without judging, without expecting, without trying to control. Because only in this space of true silence can something deep begin to move. A subtle, forgotten vibration, but one that has always been there. Today, you will understand why the way you observe the world, yourself, and your sensations may be the true trigger of the spiritual awakening you've always sought. Because maybe what is dormant in you is not just an energy, but your ability to clearly see what is already alive. And that's when everything begins to change. Long before the word energy became popular in spiritual circles, Kundalini was already mentioned in sacred texts as something infinitely deeper than a force in motion. In the Tantric tradition, for example, it is described as Shakti, the very primordial consciousness in a latent state. It's not a mystical electric current. It's the very intelligence of creation, coiled at the center of the being, like a serpent at rest. And for this very reason, it does not awaken by effort, but by recognition. In the ancient schools of yoga, Taoism, and Tantra, the awakening of Kundalini was not treated as a goal to be achieved, but as a natural consequence of inner refinement. The focus wasn't to make the energy rise, but to dissolve the veils that prevent the perception of what is already present. It has always been there, dormant not because it was forgotten, but because our way of living, thinking, and reacting has distanced us from the subtle vibration where it moves. These traditions taught that Kundalini does not need to be activated like a magic button. It is like a flower that opens when the environment is favorable, and this environment is internal: silence, surrender, pure observation. When the mind is agitated, the body tenses and the energy remains contained. But when the mind quiets and the heart opens to what is, it awakens, not like an explosion, but like an ancient memory returning gently, like a cellular memory of the divine in you. What makes this origin so hidden, however, is not the complexity of the ancient texts, but the simplicity of the truth they carry. Because everything that is simple and essential tends to be ignored. Instead, we build rituals, methods, scales of evolution, all useful at a certain level, but often loaded with effort and expectation. And effort, when excessive, distances us from the vibrational essence of Kundalini. Because this energy does not respond to control. It responds to space. And that space opens when you observe. This is where consciousness and energy meet. Kundalini, at its origin, is not a force separate from consciousness. It is consciousness in a vibrational state. This means that the more subtle and present your states of perception become, the more sensitive and responsive this energy becomes. It's as if your ability to observe deeply is the very soil where the seed of awakening germinates. It's no coincidence that the ancients spoke of awakening and not activating. Activating carries the idea of action, of making something happen. Awakening is the opposite. It's allowing what is already alive to manifest, like the sun that has always been behind the clouds, like the water that has always been beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Kundalini is this sacred water that begins to flow when the mind stops digging and learns to feel. This is the blind spot of most modern approaches. By treating Kundalini only as an energy to be unlocked, we lose the sacred sense that it is, in fact, a presence, a dormant consciousness that moves when recognized. And this recognition does not come from words, nor from sophisticated techniques. It comes from the quality of the gaze, from silent surrender, from the inner space where you don't demand, don't compare, don't seek, you simply become available. And in this state of availability, the body begins to respond, not with mystical fireworks, but with subtle signs. a slight expansion in the chest, a warmth rising effortlessly, an intuition pulsing with more clarity. These are the first movements of Kundalini, not as something coming from outside, but as something that has always been asking for passage from within. The hidden origin of Kundalini, then, is not in secret mantras or lost ancestral techniques. It is in the way you relate to your own inner field, with your vibration, with your silence. It is not something to be conquered, it is something to be remembered, and you begin to remember when you learn to observe. Most people still associate spiritual awakening with great mystical experiences, altered states, or revelations that break the logic of daily life. But the quietest truth, and therefore the most powerful, is that awakening rarely happens in explosions. It happens in the spaces between one thought and another, in the moments when the inner gaze stops judging and simply observes. To observe with purity is one of the most revolutionary acts a human being can perform, because true observation carries no desire. It doesn't try to correct, fix, or explain. It is simply present. And this presence, when it becomes constant, creates a vibrational field where everything begins to reorganize, including the subtle energy of Kundalini, which responds directly to the quality of internal focus. But what is, in fact, observing with purity? It is being with what is, without wanting to transform it. It is noticing what you feel in the body, the mind, the heart, and allowing that to exist without creating narratives, justifications, or resistance. Because all resistance creates tension, and all tension blocks the flow. When the tension disappears, the invisible begins to move. The mind has been trained to act, interfere, control, and so observing seems like something small, almost useless, but it only seems that way because silent focus, when maintained effortlessly, begins to dissolve deep layers of the unconscious. What was once repressed or distorted by inner criticism begins to reveal itself. Emotions emerge, sensations take shape, and with them, a new intelligence begins to operate, the intelligence of presence. True observation is not mental. It is vibrational. You feel when you are truly observing because something in you becomes light, even in the face of pain. You are no longer trying to escape or solve. You are simply there, witnessing. And this witnessing, this non-reactive state of presence, creates a direct bridge between consciousness and energy. This bridge is the channel where Kundalini begins to move. And here is the secret. The movement of energy does not begin in the body. It begins in how you observe it. If there is judgment, criticism, or an attempt to control, the energy withdraws. But if there is silent acceptance, if there is internal space for everything to be as it is, the energy awakens. Slowly, subtly, but it awakens. That is why simple practices, almost invisible to the external eye, are so transformative. Sitting in silence for a few minutes, observing the breath without interference, noticing thoughts as clouds passing by, being with a difficult emotion without trying to change it. All of this may seem small, but vibrationally, they are portals. Each act of presence opens a crack, and through those cracks, the energy of awakening begins to reveal itself. It is not a matter of time. It is a matter of quality of presence. You can practice for years without results if you are merely repeating movements with a disconnected mind. But you can have a deep glimpse of the energy in just a few moments of pure observation. Because there is no effort. There is surrender. And where there is surrender, there is openness. Where there is openness, consciousness enters. And where consciousness enters, Kundalini responds. This energy that so many try to force reveals itself when you stop trying and begin to observe. Because observation is the most loving gesture that exists. It's like saying to the body, the mind, the emotions, I see you, and it's all okay. And it is this silent acceptance that changes everything, because it dissolves what was blocked. And what was blocked begins to flow. This flow doesn't need to be grand. It can begin with small perceptions, a subtle warmth at the base of the spine, a slight tingling in the hands, a sensation of expansion in the center of the chest. These are signs, not that something is starting, but that something that has always been there is finally being seen. To observe, then, is not just a mental act. It is a path of reconnection with the vibrational intelligence that sustains life. It is the point where the mind bows to mystery, where control dissolves and gives way to listening. And in that listening, the invisible moves. Because what is observed with truth can no longer remain asleep. There is a silent idea that runs through almost every spiritual seeker, that in order to awaken, one must try harder, meditate for more hours, do more practices, study more, control thoughts more, repress impulses more. This mindset, although it may seem dedicated and committed, actually hides an invisible trap. The belief that the natural state of consciousness must be achieved through struggle. And this is one of the greatest illusions on the path. The truth is that excessive spiritual effort creates exactly the opposite of what is sought: tension. And tension, no matter how subtle, contracts. It closes the internal channels through which energy flows. It generates expectation, and all expectation leads to frustration. And frustration, even when silent, begins to contaminate the vibration. It's like trying to make a flower bloom by forcefully pulling its petals open. The result is not blossoming, it's rupture. But why is this idea of effort still so present? Because it feeds the spiritual ego, that part of us that wants to control even its own awakening, that wants to prove it's capable, that wants a method, a step-by-step, a safe shortcut. And in this attempt to become enlightened through performance, it forgets that true awakening happens when control is released, when the inner space opens, when consciousness surrenders to what is. You don't need to force the flow, you need to allow it. And allowing requires another kind of strength, that of surrender, that of trust, that of listening. This is what almost no one says because it doesn't sell in ready-made formulas. But Kundalini, this subtle and living intelligence, does not respond to the rigidity of a plan. It responds to the field, to the internal state, to the frequency you emit when you stop trying to be something and simply become available. The problem isn't the practices themselves. Many of them are precious tools. The problem lies in the internal place they come from. If you sit down to meditate with the feeling that you need to achieve something, you're feeding lack. You're telling the field that you are not yet complete, and the field responds to that. But if you sit with presence, with humility, with surrender, then you are already in the state you were seeking. And it is there, in that vibrational space, that something begins to move. It's not about doing more. It's about observing differently. Because the more you try to reach awakening as a destination, the farther it seems. But when you stop running and become present with what you feel now, awakening reveals itself as something that was already happening, silently, behind every breath, every repressed emotion, every ignored sensation. That's why no one told you this before. Because simplicity is almost imperceptible to a mind conditioned to effort. It wants complex paths, secret techniques, external validations. But the real spiritual movement begins when you unlearn all of that, when you allow yourself to fall into the void. And in that void, the energy awakens. Kundalini doesn't need a push. It needs a space where it feels safe. And that space is born from gentle observation, sincere acceptance, the silent love you offer yourself when you stop demanding transformation and start listening to what is already alive. If this touched something in you, if it made sense in a way you can't explain, then you've already begun to let go of the effort, and that alone is already a profound movement. Now I invite you to do something simple. Like this video if it brought you clarity, and in the comments write the phrase, "I release effort and allow the flow." Because when you write, you anchor. And when you anchor, the field responds. For a long time, it was believed that the awakening of the Kundalini was an ascending movement, an energy rising up the spine, activating energy centers until reaching the top of the head. And yes, that is one of the visible aspects of the process. But the image of the rising serpent is only an incomplete metaphor. The more subtle, and often ignored, truth is that the serpent doesn't rise because it was pushed. It rises because it awakened, and it only awakens when it feels safe. The serpent has always been an ambiguous symbol. In many cultures, it represents both poison and healing, death and rebirth, the sleeping force and the awakening consciousness. In the context of Kundalini, it does not represent just a dormant, raw energy. It symbolizes a living intelligence, instinctive and deeply connected to the wisdom of the body. And like any instinctive being, it does not respond to commands. It responds to the environment. The serpent awakens when the inner field becomes receptive, when the body stops fighting what it feels, when the mind stops demanding a result, when the heart opens, not to something new, but to what has always been there. It doesn't awaken because you want it to. It awakens because you stopped resisting, because you offered space, because your presence became soft enough for silence to become a home. This is one of the greatest mistakes on the spiritual path, thinking that energy needs to be driven by effort, by willpower, by strict discipline. But Kundalini is not an entity to be dominated. It is an expression of life itself seeking passage, and life does not blossom under pressure. It blossoms in acceptance, in stillness, in recognition. Imagine the serpent at rest, coiled at the base of the being. It is not asleep because it was forgotten. It is asleep because it has not yet found the vibrational field where it can move safely. That field is not created by intense rituals or exhaustive techniques. It is born from small internal gestures, breathing slowly, feeling without running away, looking without judging, being with the body like someone holding a child who has cried for a long time and, for the first time, finds a lap. And when that internal lap becomes real, something begins to change, not like an explosion, but like a warmth that slowly emerges, like a gentle pulsation at the base of the spine, like an almost imperceptible expansion in the center of the chest. These are the first signs, not that the serpent is rising, but that it is awakening, that it has begun to trust you, that your body has ceased to be a battlefield and has become a safe temple for sacred energy to dwell. The serpent represents the primordial wisdom of nature. It does not reason, it feels. And for this very reason, its language is not mental, it is vibrational. It senses the quality of the internal environment. It perceives whether you are present or trying to control, whether you are welcoming or resisting, whether you are forcing or surrendering. And only when feeling becomes stronger than thinking does it begin to move. This movement is less about direction and more about vibration. It's as if the energy were waiting not for an open path, but for a vibrational permission. And that permission is not given through words or intentions. It is given through silence, through observation, through listening to the body, through the ability to be with what emerges without wanting to interfere. The serpent does not need to be taken to the top. It needs to be heard where it is. It does not want to leave its natural state. It wants to be recognized in it. And when recognized, it reorganizes itself. It stretches. It expands. Not because you asked it to, but because you allowed it. This is the turning point, when you understand that Kundalini is not a ladder to be climbed, but an intelligence to be awakened. And that this awakening does not require effort. It requires presence. Because the serpent doesn't rise. It awakens. And it awakens the very moment you stop pushing it and begin, finally, to listen. Many try to communicate with spiritual energy through the mind. They try to awaken Kundalini with affirmations, visualizations, positive thoughts, and verbal commands. But what few realize is that this energy does not understand words. It does not respond to concepts. The language of Kundalini is older than language. It is vibration. And for that reason, it only reveals itself when the body feels, not when the mind tries to explain. Kundalini is a silent intelligence. It moves not by logic, but by resonance. This means it perceives the truth of your vibration even before you become aware of what you're feeling. If you say, "I am ready," but internally are still in tension, fear, or resistance, it does not move, because it's not the word that communicates, it's the state. It's the field you emanate when the mind goes quiet and feeling takes center stage. It's not about eliminating thoughts, but about not giving them command over the experience. When the focus is excessively on the mind, the body takes a back seat, and it is in the body, this living and sensitive temple, that Kundalini manifests. It is the body that vibrates, pulses, heats up, expands. It is through it that the energy responds. And the more you listen to the body with pure attention, the more clearly you begin to perceive this invisible language that vibrates in every cell. That's why silent practices are so powerful. Because they create a space where the body can speak, and the body speaks in warmth, in chills, in pulsations that arise without reason. It speaks when you feel an old emotion dissolve effortlessly, when a pain disappears just by being welcomed, when an insight arrives without having been thought. These are the signs, small but deep, as if life itself were whispering that it's listening to you. The mind, as brilliant as it may be, operates in comparison. It wants to understand, measure, define. But Kundalini energy is paradoxical. The more you try to name it, the more it hides. The more you observe it with neutrality, the more it reveals itself. Because it is made of the same substance as feeling, and feeling does not need to be explained. It needs to be inhabited. You can repeat 1,000 empowerment affirmations and change nothing. But a single moment of true silence can open a vibrational portal. Because in silence, you are not trying to create something. You are being, and being, when present, is irresistible to consciousness. It attracts, it invites, it transforms, without effort, without logic, without script. Kundalini doesn't care whether you've read the right books. It wants to feel whether you are present in your body now, whether you are truly breathing or just thinking about breathing, whether you are feeling the heart or just talking about love, whether you are available or just waiting for the right moment. Because for it, the right moment is always now, and the now doesn't need explanation. It needs presence. When you begin to live this way, with more listening and less imposition, something inside you changes frequency. Not dramatically, but constantly. You realize you no longer need to force awakening. It begins to happen as a natural unfolding of your vibration. And that's when the practice becomes prayer. Not because you are asking for something, but because your very presence becomes a form of communion. Sincere observation, when free from the intention to control, transforms into clear vibration. And this clarity is like a silent call. The energy hears, the field responds, and Kundalini begins to move, not because it was activated by words, but because it was touched by a real presence. This is where everything changes. You realize you are not speaking to the energy. You are feeling with it. You are vibrating with it. You are letting it guide you, not through logic, but through resonance. And in this surrender, you enter another kind of conversation. A conversation that doesn't go through the mind. A conversation that happens at the vibrational level, where everything that is true is already being said without words. There comes a moment on the path when observing stops being just a practice and begins to become a state of silent surrender, of reverence for what is. In that moment, what once was a technique becomes prayer. Not a spoken, requested, or thought prayer, but a vibrated, felt, lived in the body prayer. Because when observation deepens to the point of dissolving the desire to interfere, what remains is communion. And communion is prayer without words. Observing with presence is much more than seeing. It is welcoming with the inner gaze everything that was once rejected. It is allowing the body to speak without being corrected. The emotion to come without being pushed away. The moment to reveal itself without being manipulated. And when this happens, something inside you bows with humility before the mystery, as if saying, I don't understand everything, but I am here. And this being here is in itself a sacred gesture. Most people pray by asking, observe expecting a result, meditate wanting to reach a state. And in this expectation, the mind remains at the center. But when you observe without seeking anything, not peace, not an answer, not transformation, you become pure space. And in that space, the entire field reorganizes, because the energy feels when you have stopped fighting. And that's when the invisible begins to move, not because you pulled it, but because you allowed it. This type of prayer doesn't happen from the outside in. It sprouts from a silence that was already there. A silence that always accompanied you, but that you didn't hear because you were too busy trying to change everything. When you sit just to feel what is present, without naming, judging, or running, that silence reveals itself. And in it, there is a peace that doesn't depend on circumstance. A peace that comes from the simple fact that you've stopped running from yourself. Observation becomes prayer when the gaze is filled with love. Not romantic or idealized love, but radical love that includes everything as it is, that embraces pain as part of the whole, that recognizes the shadow without trying to eliminate it, that understands that even resistance has its wisdom, and in that welcoming, everything finds its place. Nothing needs to be fixed, nothing needs to be denied. Everything can simply be. This is the deepest prayer that exists, to be whole in the now, without demanding anything, without asking the universe to change course. Just being, feeling, recognizing, breathing with what is. And in that breathing, the body aligns, the heart softens, the mind quiets, and what seemed like stagnation begins to show itself as gestation. Because many times what you called a block was just life waiting for you to surrender. At that point, observation stops being a tool and becomes a temple. Everything you feel becomes part of the rite. Pain becomes the altar. Tiredness becomes incense. Silence becomes song. There is no more separation between what you live and what you honor. Your experience becomes your offering. Your presence becomes prayer. And when that happens, Kundalini awakens in another way. It doesn't explode, it blossoms. It moves like a warm breeze rising slowly, like an old sigh being released from the body, like a gentle intuition saying, "You have returned. Return to yourself. Return to the point where everything begins, and nothing else needs to be achieved." Observation becomes prayer when you understand that the universe is not waiting for your words. It is feeling your vibration. And your vibration changes when you trade control for listening, when you stop forcing and start offering, when you transform each instant of presence into a gesture of silent love. Because in the end, perhaps there is nothing more spiritual than being whole in the now. This is the secret that cannot be taught, only felt. When you reach this point, everything changes frequency. The seeking stops, the pressure quiets, the separation disappears, and what remains is you, in a state of prayer. A being who observes, feels, breathes, and for that very reason, is already in communion with the divine. We've reached the end of our journey. And perhaps now you realize that Kundalini does not awaken when you try to reach it, but when you silence the effort and begin to truly observe what is already alive within you. It's not about rising, it's about awakening. It's not about thinking, it's about feeling. And in that feeling, something changes. Your vibration speaks louder than any word, and the field begins to respond. If all this resonated with you, then something has already started to move, and that is what matters most. Now just continue nurturing this space with presence, with listening, with small moments of awareness throughout the day. And if you've made it this far, write in the comments, "I listen to what is alive in me." That way I'll know you walked with me to the end, in presence.